Dr. Launius is principal of Launius Historical Services in Auburn, Alabama. Between 1990 and 2002, he served as the chief historian of NASA, which honestly, that blows my mind. From there, he moved on to the Smithsonian Institute's National Air and Space Museum, where he served most recently as Associate Director for Collections and Curatorial Affairs. He is the author most recently of the Smithsonian History of Space Exploration from the Ancient World to the Extraterrestrial Future. Pretty interesting guy. He has been writing for years and years and years, and I think we're really honored to have him here. My hope with having him here was that, Roger, you didn't hear earlier, but Laura Forsyth was talking about millennials don't understand the Apollo program, right? I mean, they're 30 years old, 40 years old, and they've never encountered, you know, arguably some of NASA's greatest hits. So I'm really glad to kind of have you here to give us some perspective. Thank you for joining us.
No, my pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. But let me begin with a shameless plug. In 2019, I published a book. This is the book called Apollo's Legacy. It deals with sort of the meaning of Apollo after 50 years. And you can find it online. You can find it in at least some of the bigger bookstores. And I would invite anybody to take a look at that, which will encapsulate some of the things that I'm going to say today and a lot more beyond that. What I wanted to do was to take you back in time more than 50 years ago and to talk about the issue of the Apollo program. And it began in a very specific way. Now, I've got a few slides, and if you don't mind me showing them, I will share my screen and do so. Not a lot of slides, but I think there's a couple of things that will be useful. The first point I would make is Apollo only makes sense if you think of it in the context of the Cold War setting. It is absolutely critical that, that this is sort of the beginning point to this. Absent that rivalry, and it was a rivalry to the death. These were scorpions in a bottle, if you will. Somebody was going to win and somebody was going to lose this Cold War. And the Americans and the Russians were locked in this struggle for more than 40 years. And not until, you know, the early 1990s did this change. And again, many millennials don't remember that part of it, even the end of the Cold War. So this is, in the truest sense of the term, history to them. Those of us who are a little older like me actually remember these things and how desperate it was. And in the context of the space world, it was the competition between the Americans and the Russians that really sparked the American investment to first create NASA and ultimately to go to the moon and put in place a system to engage in space activities that were viewed as not military. Now, there was plenty of military activity done under the auspices of the Department of Defense, but that's not what NASA was intent on. And two really defining moments in the late 50s and early 60s put us on track for these sorts of things. The first was the Bay of Pigs, was the Sputnik Crisis of 1957-58, which led directly to the creation of NASA and the passage of an Education Act aimed at fostering what we now call STEM education, put tons of money into science and engineering, mathematics, and so forth, both at the K through 12 level, as well as the graduate level and the college level. And then in the early 60s, the Soviet success with the Yuri Gagarin flight in April of 1961 followed within a week by the American disaster at the Bay of Pigs, in which American-backed Cuban rebels tried to overthrow Castro in Cuba with a great failure. And the John Kennedy administration, brand new to the office, just coming aboard in in January of 1961 said, we have to do something. And that's something that they came up with was to go to the moon by the end of the decade. And I would suggest to you that for about 6 weeks, between the middle of April and the end of May, that was the window in which they could make a decision like this to go to the moon and not be laughed off the stage. If you want to be flippant about it, during that 6-week period, the moon was in the 7th house, Jupiter was aligned with Mars, and we were able to make this commitment to go to the moon by the end of the decade. Absent the situation in the spring of 1961, the United States would never have made this commitment because it was an enormously expensive commitment. And less than a week after Kennedy gave his speech about going to the moon to a joint session of Congress on May 25th of 1961, his budget director, David Bell, comes into him and says, have you seen what it's going to cost to go to the moon? NASA is going to break the bank. We've got to get out of this. And the first week of June of 1961, Kennedy goes to meet Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, for his one and only face-to-face meeting with Khrushchev, and proposes not once but twice during a 2-day meeting that they turn the Apollo program, which is now starting to get moving forward, turn it into a joint effort between the Americans and the Russians. And initially, Kennedy just sort of on his own hook suggested maybe they should do that. At the end of the day, when they got Kennedy by himself, his associates, his advisors said, you can't do this. If you do that, you will open the door for the Soviets to understand our capabilities, because space capabilities are dual use. You can use them to explore space. You can also use them to kill people and break things. And the result of that was that, okay, well, maybe I need to walk that back a little bit. Is there something else that we can do? Khrushchev initially responded that maybe that was something they should probably talk about. When he got back that night, his advisors did exactly the same thing. You can't say that. If you do, you are going to show the Americans how weak we truly are when it comes to these issues. And they were. As a society, it was closed. The rank and file in the world had no idea what the Soviets could do. All they saw was successes, because that's all the Soviets talked about. They had plenty of failures too, but unless you had access to classified materials that had been collected in a clandestine manner, you weren't necessarily privy to what they were not able to do. What you saw was the successes. In that context, both sides recognized that space was an incredible demonstration of their capability, both militarily and in other ways. They understood in 1961, as we still understand today, that the society, the civilization that masters science and technology is the one that's going to lead into the future. There is no question about that, and they knew it. And the Americans believed they needed to demonstrate this to the world, not because it's about bragging rights, although they were happy to brag, but because it was critical to persuading other nations, especially non-aligned nations, that were not a part of the American bloc to oppose the Soviets, not a part of NATO, for instance. Whose side were they going to be on in a global struggle in which somebody is going to win and somebody is going to lose? And in 61, it looked like the Soviets may have the upper hand because of their military capabilities and their demonstration of this high technology with space activity. So, is a recently independent India going to be a part of an American coalition or a Soviet coalition? Is emerging nations in Africa or Asia going to be part of an American coalition or a Russian coalition? That was what was at stake. And it's important to remember that this is not just about, we want to feel good. It's prestige. Yes, it's prestige, but it's so much more. The Soviet Union was an existential threat to the United States. It is very hard for people to understand that today unless they experienced it themselves. We believed that it was absolutely a great possibility that we could be nuked out of existence at any moment, to the extent that when I was in grammar school in the 1960s, we had duck and cover exercises where we crawled under our desks that would protect us from a nuclear blast. That was, I thought it was stupid when I was 10. And it was. Now there are threats. There's no question about that. And having weathered all of that without being nuked out of existence is maybe one of the great successes of the last half century. But it was a very real, at that particular point in time, that was an existential crisis. And it remained in place until the end of the Cold War, in which the Soviet Union collapsed and was replaced by Russia and other nations around it. We have nothing like that today. We can talk about China as a major threat, and it is, but it is not an existential threat in the same way that we viewed the Soviet Union in those days. So this is a demonstration of American prowess from a scientific and technological perspective, and it was critical for us in terms of the Cold War. And I would suggest to you that having won that Cold War space race, it was a really significant part of the winning of the Cold War altogether. I mentioned to you that Kennedy was already by middle part of 1961 trying to get out of the commitment because of the cost. He wasn't that he opposed the idea of going to the moon. It was just the concern about the cost that was involved in this. And he revisited this throughout his presidency until his assassination. In 1962, there was sort of a hiatus during a more tense relationship between the US and the Soviet Union. Of course, in the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a major piece of that. But thereafter, Kennedy returned to the idea of a cooperation effort with the Soviet Union. And in September, he gave a public speech at the UN in which he proposed one more time that we turn the Apollo program to land on the moon into a joint effort with the Soviet Union. And Sergei Khrushchev, who is the son of the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, recently deceased. He was on the faculty at Brown University. At that point in time, in 1963, was a member of the Korolev Design Bureau in the Soviet Union, and Korolev was the central individual behind the Soviet space program. And so Sergei Khrushchev was involved in this effort. He said he got a call after that speech to the UN from his father, Nikita Khrushchev, to come to the Kremlin and to talk to him about this. And they met that next day and discussed it in great detail. Other people were in the room with them. And they all agreed that it might be a good thing to try to bring the programs, the American program and the Russian program together. For one thing, they could reduce the cost that they had to spend on these space activities, and they could lessen tensions at the same time. They were still concerned about technology transfer and betraying what their actual capabilities were. The Americans were as well. But both sides proceeded in the fall of 1963 with a possible agenda moving forward of turning this into a cooperative effort. Nothing came of it. Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, and Khrushchev was deposed not too long after that. And the result was it came to nothing, but it is a fascinating question to which we will never know the answer, what might have been able to happen. Had there been a cooperative venture established in the mid-1960s. And Kennedy was very concerned about this because of the cost and a fear that the Republicans would use this against him in the election when he ran for re-election in 1964. I've sort of walked through all of these particular basics. It was geopolitical. It was expensive. $25.4 billion cost in 1960s dollars. That's approaching 300 billion in today's dollars. Program life, more than a decade, multiple presidential administrations. Obviously, 6 successful landings, the first one in 1969, the last one in 72, 3 circumlunar flights. One of those circumlunar flights, Apollo 13, was an accident. They didn't intend to, they wanted to land, but obviously they could not do so. And I'm sure everybody on this webinar is well familiar with that particular story. But this is the chart I really wanted to show you. So this is a percentage of the federal budget allocated to NASA over time. And I used the percentage just so I wouldn't have to deal with inflation factors and all that sort of thing. So you see that big spike, that ramp up in the early 1960s. That is the investment that took us to the moon. And you can see that it peaks 64, 65, 66 time frame, and then it goes right back down. That was what we needed to go to the moon. And at its height, it's approaching 4% of the federal budget. Today, the NASA budget, you probably are aware, is less than 0.5%. And it's been declining more or less ever since the mid-1970s after Apollo. You have to ask the question, if there is to be a future activity on the size and scale of an Apollo, maybe there doesn't have to be, but if there is, you have to ask yourself the question, what is the driver that will make that budget increase? Maybe not to, 4% of the federal budget, but, maybe a doubling of the NASA budget or a tripling of the NASA budget, which is still not that great. And do you see a reason to expend those resources? The public has demonstrated over and over again that they like space flight, but they don't want to pay for it. And that makes them, that's actually true for almost all government services. We like the services, but we don't want to pay for them because we don't like the taxes. And so I did an analysis a number of years ago on public opinion polls. And, we can talk about the good parts and the bad parts of public opinion polls and how they can be manipulated in certain ways. But I just want to give you a sense of the kind of thing that we're talking about, using 3 graphs of 3 different sets of polls that ask a specifically different question. So if you ask the question, are we spending too much on space? You get the red line. And you can see that it goes up and down. The yes answer, by the way, yes, we're spending too much on space, is what is being tracked here. So, mid-1963, about 35% of the public said, yeah, we're spending too much. It goes down a little bit, 64 goes back up, 65. And then at the time that Apollo is successful in the latter part of the 1960s, it just takes off. Yeah, we're spending too much. The first meeting that Tom Paine, who was the NASA administrator who took over for James Webb in the fall of 1968, his first meeting with the new president, Richard Nixon. Nixon pulls out a bunch of these charts and he says, basically, the problem is you guys are viewed as military spending. And the public doesn't want to spend for Vietnam. They don't want to spend for space, and your budget is going down. There is no way around that. And it's a reflection of that particular mindset. We're spending too much. If you ask the question, is Apollo worth the cost? You get that blue line. And you can see it wavers up and down between about 35 and 45% who think, yeah, it's worth the cost. But that's a whole lot less than 50%. And the only time it gets over 50% is in 1969 at the time of the moon landings, and immediately starts down again. The public doesn't want to do it. They don't think it's worth the cost. But if you divorce your opinion polling from the issue of budget and money, and you say, do you approve of Apollo? And it's a yes/no answer. The yes is tracked in the green line. Yeah, we all like Apollo. It's terrific. It goes down a little bit in 67, 68 at the time of the accident, of the Apollo 1 accident, but then right back up. And at no point does it dip below 50%. We all like it. We don't want to pay for it. And that has been the story of federal expenditures for NASA ever since. The question I always ask people is, a lot of people say, how come we can't get more money for NASA? The question I ask is, how come we're getting so much when there is clearly not an impetus to do very much? Now, all of this goes away when you're not talking about public funding. If it's about private sector activities, well, if you've got people who want to spend the money, that's fine. But they usually have to have a reason too. And that reason fundamentally is about economics. And the bottom line with Apollo is we didn't want to pay for it, but we also didn't find anything there that we wanted. I'm a historian, so I tend to think about everything in terms of analogies. Terrestrial exploration on this continent, actually anywhere in the world, has been driven, and I specifically would hearken, I heard Josh talk a little bit about Columbus and so forth earlier. The idea behind this fundamentally is exploration. It really takes three basic ingredients to be sustained historically from a terrestrial perspective. One is that the quest for what I refer to them as the three G's: God, gold, and glory. You go somewhere and you find something that you want that's worth money. That's the gold part. Well, the Spanish explorers, the French explorers, to some extent the English, but a little bit later on in North America and South America, found a lot of wealth, most of which they took away from other people. But be that as it may, they found that wealth, and that sustained them pretty fundamentally for a long period of time. In fact, it's that wealth that was extracted from the Americas that made, hard to believe, Spain a world power in 1500. The gold, so that's the gold part. The God part is we're going to go to these new locations and we're going to convert the natives to whatever form of religion exists within the state that is sponsoring these particular expeditions. And then finally, the glory part is the bragging rights. And that's very real, no question about that, but it doesn't sustain very much. That's what the first person goes to, but the second person is not really sustained by that in the same way because it's not about bragging anymore. The problem with Apollo is we didn't find any of the gold thing, anything that we wanted. Doesn't mean it's not there. We didn't find it. Josh talked about helium-3 a little bit and other types of minerals that might exist there, and they may be there. Whether or not they're there in abundance, whether or not they can be mined in a manner that is that makes them cost-effective to extract, all of that's an open question, but nonetheless, those are issues moving forward. So fundamentally, that's why we stopped going in 72. And lots of people have looked back and said, why did we stop? That's the reason. We had achieved the objectives for which we had established that particular program. We had, and there's no question about this, brought into the American sphere of influence a large number of non-aligned nations that were attracted to the American side of this global Cold War struggle because of this and other activities that the US engaged in. We've sought to engage in returns to the moon, and this is one of the great problems, I believe, that we've got in the context of the space community. We learned one of the wrong lessons from the Apollo program, and that is that if we could get a president to make a brilliant speech and set forth a bold vision, all things would flow from it. And we've been successful in doing that several times. So the first President Bush in 1989 stood on the steps of my museum, the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and announced that we're going to go back to the moon and on to Mars. And this became known as the Space Exploration Initiative. The budget for that was officially couched at NASA at approximately $400 billion. And oh, by the way, The response from members of Congress when this got briefed to them was, "Are you people insane?" And end of discussion. It went away very quietly at the end of the Bush administration. The second Mr. Bush, after the Columbia accident in January 2004, went to the NASA headquarters and announced that we're going back to the moon and on to Mars. And we're also going to retire the shuttle, and we're going to finish the space station, and so on. These did not generate much in the way of a positive response. There was no significant increase in the NASA budget to make any of this happen. And it might not require the kind of percentages that I showed you earlier on, but there really wasn't much of anything in terms of a growth beyond that. And so consequently, they just went by the board. The same is true with the Trump administration. In 2019, announced that they were going to return to the moon with a date of 2024. And well, the clock has ticked. We're now in 2021. Does anybody have any possibility to think there'll be astronauts landing on the moon by 2024? No. Maybe 2034. Could be a little earlier, but somebody's gonna have to make a decision and put some money behind it. Famous line from a movie of the mid-90s with Tom Cruise: "Show me the money and then we'll talk." That's the problem we've got. And I would suggest to you that has been the wrong lesson. We have learned this, but it's inappropriate for us to think getting a president to say these things is going to solve the problem. But the larger question is this one, and it's the family circus cartoon that you can see on the left on this slide. See this little kid looking on television, sees a space thing there. Someday I might travel to another planet, but I'm not sure why. And the why is the core problem. So if there's anything the Moon Society can do to sell the American public on the why, I urge you to try to do it. And I think I will stop with that. I had another slide that I could go through, but I will just leave it there. And if there are any questions or comments, I'm happy to engage.
Well, I love that that's your stopping point, because that is the driver, right? Why are we at the Moon Society event today? Why are we at the Lunar Development Conference today? What is the Moon Society going to do tomorrow and the next day and the next day? What are the members going to do? I mean, I think that is where we are exactly. I am new to the Moon Society, so I'm not speaking on their behalf. But I do feel like that this organization has a tremendous amount of untapped potential. And maybe that is one of the things that we do, is figure out the why, because I think there's a lot of good reasons. So pretty excited about your talk.
Thanks. And by the way, I think the why comes down to economics.
Yeah.
Can
no argument here. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the goal.
It is that business case to be made where you can make money going to the moon. People will figure out a way to go to the moon and do things. Yeah. We have done that in Earth orbit. Earth orbit has become a normal realm of human activity really since 2000. And we don't think twice about that anymore. It's a very viable economic activity, but we're not there yet in terms of cislunar and translunar space.
No.
And that's what's got to be found.
I'm particularly interested to hear in about an hour, General Warden is going to come on board, and my claim is that the new moon rush is directly attributable to the missions that he helped foster with Clementine and L-Cross, because when we found water, suddenly we had a why. Suddenly there was gold, that you referred to gold, glory, and God. And
right. Yeah, we haven't found any extraterrestrials to convert yet.
Not yet. Not yet. Well, the report that came out of the Pentagon a couple of weeks ago could have changed that a little bit, but no. All right, sir. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. I don't know if you saw it in the chat, but I posted a lot of your books, and I'm going to just do a shout out to this paper that you wrote about historic analogs. I posted that also I think is particularly interesting and relevant to developing out the moon. So, sir, thank you very much, Dr. Launius. We're going to move on, and we appreciate your time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.